External evidence for the early dating of Revelation. There are several writings and authors that we can turn to that give us evidence that Revelation was written much earlier than the AD 95-96 date preferred by the dispensationalist, futurist school of interpretation. Gentry writes about 4 of these in his book, Navigating the Book of Revelation: the Shepherd of Hermas, Papias, the Muratorian Canon, and Clement of Alexandria. First, the Shepherd of Hermas. This book itself is so ancient that the early fathers debated its potential canonicity. Authors such as Irenaeus thought it was among the inspired literature. Many, if not most authors agreed that it was written by the Hermas written about in Paul's epistle to the Romans, and that it was written in the AD 80s or 90s. Since all commentators agree that the imagery in Shepherd draws on that of Revelation, the early date of Hermas requires an early date of Revelation, especially since it would not only have to have been penned by then, but copied, circulated, well-known, and considered authoritative. External evidence number 2, Papias. The church father Papias lived from AD 60 to AD 130, and is thought to have been the bishop of Hierapolis. We have none of his writings extant, but have his writing preserved in quotes and fragments cited in the writing of others. His record is the earliest on the origin and authorship of our Gospels. Gentry cites him as writing that James and John suffer martyrdom together at the hands of the Jews. Since we know from other historians like Eusebius that James died before the destruction of the temple, then John, who met a similar fate on his view, would have died before AD 70 as well, thus making it impossible for him to have written Revelation in AD 90s. Regardless of when John really died, this shows us that Papias thought Revelation predated the destruction of the temple. Don't forget, Papias lived from 60 to 130 AD. External evidence number 3, the Muratorian Canon. From about AD 170, we have what is thought to be our earliest surviving list of inspired books of the New Testament. It's not a complete list, as we have in Origen, and also finally received in the 4th century, but it is a significant list that makes mention of John the Gospel writer and presumes him to be the same John of the Apocalypse. When the author discusses the letters of Paul, which were written to 7 different early churches, he says that this collection follows the pattern set by John in his writing to the 7 churches in Revelation. In so doing, he writes that the blessed Apostle Paul, following the rule of his predecessor John, writes to no more than 7 churches. Since Paul wrote his epistles throughout the AD 50s and early 60s, and died in about AD 64, John would have to have written his 7 letters prior to this. External evidence number 4, Clement of Alexandria, AD 150 to 215. In refuting the heresies that arose in the 2nd century and later, Clement gives evidence of the early dating of all of the New Testament. He writes that Jesus taught before and then died under the reign of Emperor Tacitus, and that all of the teachings of the apostles were completed prior to the death of Nero in AD 68. Says Kenneth Gentry, but he does believe Revelation is inspired revelation from God and is written by the Apostle John. The teaching of the apostles, embracing the ministry of Paul, ends with Nero. Thus, he becomes a witness for the early date of Revelation. Gentry discusses Clement in greater detail in his book Before Jerusalem Fell, and I'll include some of that discussion in the refutation of the contrary evidence